Oh, you're fancy. Because there's a red button, like it would light up.
It's just for looks. It doesn't really-
That's all I'm for too. I am just for looks. I'm often told that, just eye candy. Yes, exactly, exactly. It is 1 p.m. on the West Coast. I know people are dialing in from around the world because of our global reach and scope. But we're going to go ahead. We're going to start on time and end on time and respect your time. So that will be our mantra. I am delighted that you're all here, and I want to especially thank our amazing team at the California Transportation Commission and our partners from Caltrans and other agencies to make today's today's um, workshop, that was the word, possible. So I want to thank you all, to our transportation partners, our stakeholders, and members of the public. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our March 2024 Project Delivery Workshop. My name's Carl Guardino. I have the honor of serving as chair of our California Transportation Commission, sharing the dais, of course, with Tanisha Taylor, our executive director, and thrilled to introduce our newest commissioner, hailing from Hollister in San Benito County, Bob Tiffany, who is with us in person as well. Douglas, if you don't mind, would you please call the roll and provide us with instructions as well?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Bradshaw, Commissioner Cruz, Commissioner Eager,
She's on her way.
Commissioner Falcone, Commissioner Lugo, Vice Chair Grisby, Commissioner Norton, Commissioner Tavalone, Commissioner Tiffany,
Here.
Chair Guardino,
Present.
Senator Cortez, Assemblymember Wilson. Thank you, Chair.
Doug, thank you. Are there any instructions that you'd like to provide at this time as well?
Yes, Chair, I certainly will.
Thank you.
Welcome to the CTC Project Delivery Workshop. The CTC exists to make transportation planning, funding, and policy more understandable and accountable. Our workshops can take place in diverse locations around the state so that commissioners and staff can hear directly from our stakeholders around California. We are pleased to now offer hybrid and fully virtual workshops to allow our stakeholders an opportunity to participate more fully, no matter where you are. The workshop agenda is located on our website at www.catc.ca.gov. Closed captioning is available on this webinar. You should see them on your, you select the Show Captions tab at the bottom of your screen. There are a number of language options available there to choose from. American Sign Language translation is also being provided. You should see the translators on your screen. Any document the CTC creates can be translated into any language you need. Simply email us at catc@catc.ca.gov. We'll have them returned to you as quickly as possible. For all of our workshops, we encourage interaction with our stakeholders. There will be opportunity for questions and comments. For those attending via Zoom, you should see the webinar control panel, likely located at the bottom of your screen. There you'll find the raise hand Q&A tab. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature as soon as we reach the public comment items or when questions are asked to give the system time to acknowledge it. Commission staff will let you know when it's your turn to make your comment. Alternately, you may use the Q&A tab to submit your comment or question. Commission staff will read that on your behalf. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link to access the webinar. These should not be shared with other participants so they can create confusion for staff when making your comment. Please do your best to be concise. Please make sure that your comments add new information. If you agree with the comments of a previous speaker, simply make that statement. Thank you for joining.
Doug, thank you. And let's let the minutes show that right when you started the instructions, immediate past chair Leanne Eager joined us. Thank you. The commission hosts these workshops as a means to have conversations on specific transportation-related topics in a more informal environment. This allows more detailed discussions without the same time constraints that can often occur during regular commission meetings that have a large number of agenda items which to get through. Today, we have 3 topics to discuss with Caltrans subject matter experts: the Fish Passage Program, overview, challenges, and solutions; the geotechnical site characterization, the overview of how Caltrans performs and determines site conditions; and finally, the second quarter project delivery report for the 23-24 fiscal year. We look forward to having a robust discussion on these topics such that we have a better understanding of these important transportation-related topics. I'm now going to turn it over to Timothy Sobelman, the CTC's Chief Engineer, to introduce our first topic. Timothy?
I'm happy to be having a project delivery workshop today. Before getting started, I wanted to thank Caltrans for their willingness to meet today to discuss some important topics. The first topic of today is the Caltrans Fish Passage Program. The request for this topic stems from questions on projects that came before the Commission for supplemental funds, increased allocations, and/or time extensions, with a portion of the change being related to fish passage. In addition, there was a Commissioner question that asked if there are best practices being shared statewide when developing fish passage remediation strategies. Melinda Molnar, Caltrans Chief of the Office of Fish and Wildlife Connectivity in the Division of Environmental Analysis, is here to provide a presentation on the Caltrans Fish Passage Program.
And for your time to consider the Fish Passage Program. Is there? Oh, thank you. So today we're going to talk about the Fish Passage Program. Next slide, please. To summarize the discussion, we'll be talking about the legislation that requires Caltrans to address fish passage on the state highway system. We'll talk about partnerships that were developed to prioritize and develop science and data for those fish passage barriers, how we collect that data, our engineering practices and our standard solutions, permitting efficiencies for restoration projects, funding opportunities using transportation dollars and as well as federal dollars and other state and local grants, as well as the challenges and solutions to planning and delivering these projects. Next slide, please. So Streets and Highways Code 156, Senate Bill 857 that was passed in 2005 has, we've been working towards the requirements of that bill for almost 20 years now. It prohibits actions that extend the service life of a barrier to salmon and steelhead on the state highway system. It requires projects not to create new barriers by construction. And there's an annual report to legislature that's required to status our progress that's made annually towards identifying barriers, prioritizing them, and remediating them. And each year, those highlighted items are priority barriers, are completed remediations, projects that are active in the delivery process that are allocated, assessments that are taking place across the state highway system to inventory all known barriers and to obviously rule out non-barriers. And then, as I mentioned, funding for current and planned projects. Next slide, please. So salmon and steelhead in California have habitat primarily along the coast and in the Sacramento Valley and the upper Sacramento Valley. Coho and Chinook salmon and steelhead trout are the 3 primary species that are still exist in California. The populations have reduced significantly over the last several decades, and the map that's demonstrated is the range of steelhead in California because they're the best swimmers and jumpers. So their range is the broadest of all of those species, which overlap within those areas. And the colors are just the distinct evolutionary populations of steelhead in California. Next slide, please. So these photos are representative of what a salmon and steelhead barrier looks like on the state highway system. They're culverts that are perched with significant jump barriers and typically significant scour at the outlet and deposition of sediments at the inlet. And then there could be some various older artifacts on the left of trying to allow the elevation availability for steelhead to access upper watersheds. And so sometimes there's evidence that we've tried to address in the past some salmon and steelhead barrier access issues. Next slide, please. So currently, this is from the initiation of this legislation till our last legislative report, which covers the previous calendar year. We've remediated 65 barriers, priority barriers, an estimated 920 or so miles of access for salmon and steelhead in California. So we're getting close to that 1,000 stream mile mark. I don't know how we'll celebrate. So we have 38 active projects that are between project approval and environmental document and construction, essentially. We don't count the planning phase because those aren't allocated projects. And those 38 active projects equate to an estimated 187 miles of blocked habitat that will be remediated. And we have 88 additional priority barriers that 27 of them are in the pre-project and the planning phase. They're not allocated, but they are in the planning phase, covering about 183 miles of blocked habitat for those planned projects or planning projects. And then 61 unfunded priorities where we're currently investigating opportunities to fund those for remediation. And then there's roughly another 682 known barriers, some higher priorities and some not really that essential for salmon and steelhead. And so we work with our collaborations that are statewide with state, federal, and local partners to evaluate science and data and to determine which of those 682 locations are priorities and which ones we can defer or possibly within historic habitat that will likely never recover. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we do have a fairly robust partnership, a little over 200 members of 18 state, federal, and local partners. California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Service are our two primary partners as they have oversight over both the state and federal Endangered Species Act. And salmon and steelhead in California are dual listed endangered by both state and federal endangered species laws. And so we started even before Senate Bill 857 was passed, the North Coast Fish Passage collaboration was already underway. And so we took advantage of that and developed other similar partnerships across the state because they seem to be functioning very well and a good place for us to vet that science efficiently and to have our partners help us collect that data instead of it being 100% Caltrans effort. And so we now have the Klamath Cascade and the Bay Area that covers where we are here today. The Southern Steelhead, which is Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego areas, and then the Central Valley. We needed to have a place to convene engineering expertise, not only to identify that there's an issue, but to determine what's the best solution for it. And so in 2015, we convened the engineering work group, which is an interagency partnership. And there are about 40 expert engineers that work together to continuously try to improve how the efficacy of engineering solutions. And I'll show you in a couple of slides some of their efforts. Next slide, please. So originally, we identified around 6,000 road stream crossings, excuse me, that could potentially be barriers, and many of those we have ruled out as barriers. We've assessed uh, around 3,500 of those locations to date, and those are in the highest priority areas. So we think we've identified the vast majority of important barriers across the state. But what we continue to partner with the California Conservation Corps and to deploy um, technologies that allow us to make assignments electronically and to submit that data electronically. So the labor costs have been quite low, and the rate of acquiring the data that we need has been quite expedited over about the last 3 years of this partnership. As I mentioned, we've collected about 3,500 assessments. So we believe in about the next 3 years, we will complete our entire statewide inventory for potential fish passage barriers through this partnership with the California Conservation Corps. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's the California Fish Passage Advisory Committee, and we have a website where those 210 or so partners are able to access all of the science and data to evaluate the locations using story maps and gradient mapping and photographs and other information that's provided and collected by scientists to determine where the most important locations are for recovery of species. And so this is just a place where all of those members can come and share data and to coordinate at their quarterly meetings. They meet 4 times a year. Each of those 6 groups meet 4 times a year. And they spend a lot of time working outside of that on developing science and data together. The next slide, please. So how they rank those priorities is based on species diversity. Some salmon and steelhead are endangered and others are threatened. And so it's the severity of their decline in their listing. And then sometimes salmon and steelhead, 1 or 2 or even all species are present just downstream of any given barrier. And so that is taken into consideration. The quality and the quantity of the habitat is taken into consideration, whether or not the parameters for spawning and rear their life cycles are available at the location, as well as water quality and availability and other conditions such as land use and other known restoration projects in the vicinity. Next slide, please. And the engineering work group, as I mentioned, they collaborate on guidance. Cal Fish and Wildlife has guidance, National Marine Fisheries Service has guidance, and Caltrans has guidance. So to make sure that that guidance is aligned to the effect that our engineers are able to analyze that and understand how to get a project planned and developed and to construction. And then also it's an expert panel where anyone who has a question or an issue can bring it to that group to get the support that they need for project delivery and or post-project delivery design issues occasionally. And then we also have, through that group, our structures division determined that they wanted to design a suite of small bridges to 65% design to reduce labor, reduce time for project delivery, and also they can use that small bridge efficiency anywhere. It's not necessarily limited to only salmon and steelhead barriers. They've also deployed those bridges for overcrossings and other small bridges across the state. So it has brought additional efficiencies to Caltrans projects. And also the pre-design 12 by 12 culverts have also been developed specific to fish passage needs. And then in 2022, we completed a research with the expert panel and the engineering work group. Humboldt Cal Poly led a 3-year research project to determine the efficacy of the solutions that had been implemented across the state. So they looked at, I think, about 22 of the 65 completed projects, and they told us what was functioning well, and they made some recommendations to the expert panel on items that could be approved to increase the efficacy for species and to reduce maintenance, which is one of our goals, is to not remediate salmon barriers and increase maintenance needs, to make maintenance needs, to provide efficiencies to maintenance efforts as well. Next slide, please. And so, as a part of those pre-designed bridges that I mentioned in 2014, the pilot bridge was built in Siskiyou County. It's called Fort Goff Creek. That's where that, on the left, the corrugated metal pipe was removed, and the 60-foot accelerated bridge construct, precast, pre-stressed bridge was built at that location in 1 year. So they're very efficient small bridges, and they can be built relatively quickly as well. And since that project turned out very well, Caltrans evaluated it, and Structures was very pleased with it. Our resource partners who permit were very pleased with it. And so it was determined that we would move forward with a suite of bridges from 20 to 120 feet, and any increment between those metrics for site-specific conditions. And so that efficiency came from this project. Next slide, please. Hydraulic and partial solutions are occasionally deployed on the state highway system. Technically, they're...
Can I ask a question about the last slide? That's
Sure.
me. So the Fort Goff Creek. So this is specifically for the fish to get through, right? The one on the left. So now the bridge on the right, can you ride bikes and pedestrians go across? And so now it's multi-purpose bridge?
Exactly.
Okay.
We have to meet current standards on all of our bridge projects. So complete streets, and oftentimes there will also be stormwater improvements. Sometimes we can gain total maximum daily load credits as well for our water board crediting. So we do work to try and get all the bonus points that we possibly can on the same projects, because it's efficient, and there are more partnerships and more opportunities to move the projects forward. Thank you. So as I mentioned, the hydraulic partial solutions are still partial barriers. They're definitely an improvement from the previous barrier, but sometimes site-specific complexities or other issues make it very difficult or impossible in some circumstances for the full remediation. And so sometimes it's worth considering a partial hydraulic solution, which we do in some instances. We don't always deploy bridges. Not every salmon and stream crossing needs a 20-foot or greater solution. And so there are, on the left is a precast arched culvert. It's bottomless. It's technically called a stream simulation design. And then there's a baffle on the left side of a reinforced concrete box on the right. Next slide, please.
I have a quick question. Can you, I'm confused. What is it? Can you explain again? Sorry, what does a partial solution mean? What does partial mean?
It doesn't span the bank full width. So during high waters, the velocities that are coming through either of these conveyances may still exceed that of the jumping and swimming capabilities of salmon and steelhead. But then during most of the year, it would be possible, just not during certain times where the flow rates may exceed the capabilities.
And you're talking about hydraulic solution?
It's still a hydraulic solution. Yeah, a partial.
So do you get full credit for meeting the the requirements of removing the barrier, like from the requirements from the bill, the statute? Do you get credit? Is it a full credit solution?
There's not really a credit.
Well, I mean, I
necessarily.
guess, does it get taken off the list?
No.
And why is that?
We report it as an improved fish passage remediation, but eventually when those baffles, for instance, fail, it won't be passable any longer. Like if some woody debris or large storm event or, materials erosion over time. And then eventually that the service life of that reinforced concrete box will exceed, and then a full solution will remediate it.
It seems like a lot of effort if you're not
I
getting it
agree.
off the list.
I agree.
Is that being required, like, from Department of Fish and Wildlife? Like they
Yes.
require that?
When it's a priority location, we really try to fully remediate it, but sometimes, for the 680 some other locations, sometimes there's a maintenance need. And of even a 20-foot bridge could, cut all the way from planning through contract acceptance could be, say $8 million versus a hydraulic solution, which may be 400, 500,000 on the right side, and then maybe about $1 million or $1.5 million on the left side. So sometimes maintenance just doesn't have the ability to fund a full solution with their program. So
Okay. Maybe keep going. I'll think about that a little bit more.
So with all the rains that we've been having the last year or two, and it gets to a place where it over exceeds what the fish can do, what happens to them?
they stay downstream or of the culvert, or if they're upstream of the culvert, hopefully they don't get washed downstream, and possibly they swim back up after they get washed downstream if they're adults. If they're juveniles, they may get moved out of our area for rearing, where juveniles grow and get bigger, actually. So they're not as good as a full solution, but I would love to talk more about, what the costs and benefits are of a smaller solution. And I wish there was a better way for maintenance to be able to address them in full if they had the funding to do so.
I have a question as well. So are all of these remediation projects done independently, or are they sometimes done as part of a Caltrans project, highway project, or otherwise? Or they're just all independently done? And I'm learning all this, but is it, where is the funding come?
They're all Caltrans projects for the most part. We have one project down in Southern California that Caltrout is leading and trying to get grants for, but they ultimately would like to find a nexus for transportation funding. I have a couple slides on funding where I'll tell you a lot more about that as well, but if transportation funding is allocated to a project, it's because there's a transportation nexus. The culvert is failing or the bridge is failing and we have to replace it anyhow for the most part. And then we've been very aggressive with IJA funding. And so I'll show you a couple slides on the money that we received during fiscal year 22-23 IJA funding. It's coming.
So separate from projects where maybe there's something failing or something being done by Caltrans, you are separately trying to deal with these priority barriers as well, independently.
Right, where we don't have a transportation nexus, we do try to find other opportunities to fund through other funding
Right.
methods.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. These are just a couple of examples of the full span bridge solutions. And as I mentioned, these typically are from anywhere from, well, these days I'd say around 8 million is the lowest, is around the base cost. And then for a larger 120 foot bridge, it might be closer to around 15, or, if it's in a very urban area and property costs or other hazardous waste issues, it may be a little bit more than that, around 18. Next slide, please. So this is the State Highway Systems Management Plan. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. And in 2021, the Fish Passage Program, for the first time, our inventory was included in the State Highway System Management Plan. And our asset management team at Caltrans is, they're wonderful. They provided so much support and guidance to help us figure out how to properly inventory fish passage priorities, and then to identify those needs. And then the unit costs estimates for that inventory were developed using the historic costs. We had been tracking the historic costs of projects for quite some time. And so we escalated historic costs, and then we looked at projects that were currently in development, and we categorized it by large culvert solutions, small bridges, and larger bridges. And small bridges were bridges that were 20 to 60 foot in length, and then the larger bridges were greater than 60 feet to 120 feet. There are some individual bridges that are larger than that, but their costs are complex, so we didn't cost out larger bridges than that, because the vast majority of salmon and steelhead barriers are within those 20 to 120 foot bridges. And so that's how we address the unit cost estimates. And then the needs narrative, we determined what the statewide barrier remediation need was and what the current gap was in achieving that need. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, for funding, we have the 38 active barriers that are in projects right now, have been allocated, and that's 187 miles of habitat will be remediated by those projects, and around $310 million have been invested in those 38 projects. And those are, almost all of them are bridges, because they're high priority locations. They're larger stream systems that have been blocked for the most part. And then, as I mentioned, in 2023, we were able to acquire another $26 million from the federal government. We put together 4 proposals for funding. 3 of those proposals were successfully awarded. And so up on the North Coast, in Mendocino County, we're building 2 small bridges in one project that was successful. They were awarded $15 million. And then there's another project on Humboldt 254, the Avenue of the Giants, and that project was awarded $6 million. And then there's a project down in Santa Cruz called San Lorenzo Creek in Castle Rock Park, and they were awarded another $5 million. And so we intend to go after that funding over the next 4 years. And we anticipate the notice of funding opportunity to come out any day now. Next slide, please.
Melinda, if I may, as you can see, there's great interest in your work and your presentation. And we are already having people line up virtually for public comments. I'm going to recommend that we let Melinda finish her slides. I've been writing down lots of questions that I'm going to have so that we can hear the entire presentation. So hold those questions in the room virtually, our staff colleagues and my commission colleagues, and then we'll go through them at that time. And just so that for the day's hearings, so that everyone does have a chance to be heard with questions or comments, to make sure that we are fair to everyone. When we do get to comments, we'll limit those to up to 3 minutes. Thank you. And Belinda, please continue.
Next slide, please. So we also have 27 projects that are in the planning phase, and actually developing projects in the planning phase helps us with the grant opportunities as well, because we know a lot more about costs and scope and schedule and what we might do to remediate locations. And so that it serves as a match for funding, because oftentimes grants, I think all the grants I'm aware of require match funding. And then, so we actively seek those state, federal, and local opportunities. And the IJA grants in particular are, they're very geared towards transportation opportunities. Next slide, please. I just have a few examples of other projects that have been remediated recently. Huchica Creek in Napa County on Highway 121, it was completed in 2022. And steelhead trout, coho, and Chinook salmon were all able to access 7.8 miles of habitat that was unblocked by that project. Next slide, please. Dominic Creek is up in Del Norte County. This is only maybe about 10 miles from the Oregon border, and 2.5 miles of habitat was made available to steelhead trout and coho salmon at this location. Next slide, please. When they dewatered at Dominic Creek, they found a diversity of species at that location when they were within the work area even. So there were steelhead and Chinook, salmon, as well as Pacific giant salamanders and tailed frogs. So these are some of the best habitats. And I didn't mention it, but at the Huchica Creek location, almost 7,000 fish were removed from the project area just downstream of the project during dewatering. So our priorities are locations where if we build it, they will show up immediately. Otherwise, we would have unsuccessful projects, and we don't want that. Next slide, please. This is Arroyo Paradon Creek. The location on the left was damaged greatly during some of the mudslides that had happened after fires a few years back. And so the district developed the bridge replacement very quickly within the scope of just a few years. And then they were able to replace the damaged bridge and remediate fish passage to a little over 1.2 miles of habitat for steelhead trout, which steelhead trout are endangered, and the populations in Southern California are so dire that they are predicted to potentially become extinct in the next 15 or to 20 years. And so recovering habitat for these species is paramount. Next slide, please. Little Lost Man Creek is another example of a really great fish passage remediation project. The reinforced concrete box, the double bay reinforced concrete box failed, or it was failing. And so the bridge was developed. It's a 69-foot bridge. And as I mentioned, I am the Office Chief of Fish and Wildlife Connectivity. And so for most of these full span solutions, we also have wildlife connectivity use. Next slide, please. And we deploy cameras at all of these locations. And at Little Lost Man, you'll see the very large bear on the left that utilized this undercrossing.
That explains the Little Lost Man.
And then on the right, there's an elk using the undercrossing as well. So, and so for the new wildlife law that passed last year, which I'm not necessarily here to talk about, but these are going to satisfy some of those requirements as well because of the wildlife connectivity opportunities. Next slide, please. These are just other examples of some of our completed projects where we've deployed cameras. Mountain lion, South Soquetas Creek is in Santa Barbara County, where mountain lion are candidate species for state listings. And then Up Creek is, sure you're not familiar with the Willits Bypass Project. So those are deer using one of the bridges at Up Creek from that remediation. Next slide, please. And so challenges and solutions. We have a lot of challenges, and we work hard to determine how to be more efficient, how to reduce costs. And some of those opportunities are through the pre-design that I mentioned, and it reduces the project design time and cost efficiencies. And those defined actions, because we know what we're planning to do, we can translate that into programmatic permits. We can explain to the agencies what we're going to do on certain projects so that they almost pre-agree with those types of methodologies. And it can turn an endangered species consultation from 6 months to 60 to 90 days. And so half or even less than half the amount of time. Some other permitting efficiencies, we're engaged in a programmatic consultation right now with the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to expedite permitting on salmon and steelhead remediation projects. And then we've also been collaborating with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to implement more of they have an initiative called Cutting the Green Tape. And it's, they had been criticized that restoration projects were taking too long to permit. If someone's trying to do something good, why does it take so long to implement it? And so they have put a lot of time and effort into the relatively new, I think it's 2 or 3 years old now, the Cutting the Green Tape initiative to find out how they can collaborate to get restoration projects out there more efficiently. And recently, the Cutting the Green Tape program manager reached out and said, would you like to have a summit where we can talk about how we can become even more efficient, find more efficiencies? And yes, please. And so we're going to continue to pursue that as well. Next slide, please. There's even more challenges and solutions. So funding and costs. So we've been evaluating state, federal, and local grant funding opportunities, and so we can cost share more for those projects. And then the design and permitting efficiencies that also reduced our schedules and our labor costs. Those are translating more and more into projects because they were only developed in 2020. So a lot of the projects that were in development were not using those. They were too far along, but now they're starting to really implement many more of those in the new projects that are being planned and developed. And then hydraulic engineering guidance. It's actually harder to build a partial solution than it is a full span solution because there's a lot more consideration of what the water will do if it doesn't have enough space. And so we've been working collaboratively within the engineering work group to try to better align Cal Fish and Wildlife's National Marine Fisheries Service and Caltrans design guidance for hydraulic engineers, because it's counterintuitive, but the smaller solutions are harder to design. And so that one, next slide, please. That was all I had. I appreciate everyone's time today.
That was outstanding. Thank you. Appreciate the time you've put into this and to the work you do every day for our state. As I mentioned, to make sure we not only cover this item as thoroughly as people would like, but that we get to all three items with the same amount of thoroughness. So right up front, we'll let folks know who would like to make comments. We encourage that up to 3 minutes. And as Douglas said, if someone else has already made that comment, feel free to say, I agree with the speaker X. The order we're going to go in, if it's okay, honoring the guests in the room. We'll go with guests in the room first. Then we'll go to our virtual guests, as I see that there's some already in the queue, and then staff and commissioners, and I will go last. And I'm assuming the questions I've written down will probably be covered before they get to me, and I'll just say what Leanne said. Okay. So with that, if there are guests in the room that could come forward, I assume we have speaker cards for this as well. Okay. Are there any guests in the room that would like to come forward? Because we'd like to have people line up to save that transition time and have more dialogue. Anyone? Okay, then we'll go to our virtual guests. Is there anyone still on the line that would like to have questions or make comments?
Thank you, Chair. We did receive one written comment from one of our virtual attendees.
Okay, great. Well, you have up to 3 minutes to read that comment.
All right, I will use my time wisely. This comes from a public attendee, Martha Armis Kelly. She asks, are we weighing on the tribal community in our decision making? It seemed like a big risk when questioning the vitality of the immature fish. Thank you.
You have 2 minutes and 55 seconds left.
I cede my time.
We do have tribal members of the Fish Passage Advisory Committee. The Yurok tribe and the Creek tribe both participate. And then our districts, especially those within tribal areas, do communicate regularly with the tribes to make sure that we're taking their interests into consideration as we prioritize. And we do collaborate with them on remediations that are within tribal areas.
And were there any other online questions or comments? Virtual attendees.
We just received one written comment or question. They asked for a particular slide. Would you be able to put up the before and after slide from Dominique Creek again? They didn't put any follow-up question or comment as to the reasoning, just asked for that question or asked for that.
They like their photos.
Yeah. Maybe do so.
Also a reminder that these PowerPoints are posted online on the CTC website. You can find them there.
And any other questions or comments virtually?
Beyond that, we have not received any additional questions or comments. Thank you.
Great. Please continue to let us know. Staff and commissioners, questions, comments? See Timothy Sobelman weighing in and immediate past chair Eager right after.
I can wait until after commissioner questions.
Thank you. I think, and thank you so much. Obviously, we're very interested in this and thrilled to hear all the work that's being done. I think maybe this came before us because I did ask the question about why all of a sudden are we seeing all these things about fish passages that we never saw before? And there were increases in cost and time extensions and those kinds of things. And I saw on one of the slides that you put this expert panel together in 2015. Are they still meeting? And what are we doing to minimize some of those additional costs that we keep seeing, the time extensions, and what's happening for best practices?
The engineering work group meets monthly, and it's a continuous, I don't intend to disband it. I helped to initiate it, and I facilitate, I'm not an engineer, but I facilitate the engineering discussion, and I enjoy it, so I think I'll continue to do it. And because a lot of good information and education does come out of that. I think right now, and it's not a challenge that I listed on a slide, but there's been so much turnover and so many new staff. I think a challenge is educating staff in that when they approach permitting entities and when they are planning a project, that they start by saying this is a restoration project, because oftentimes when Caltrans engages state and federal resource partners, their first thought is mitigation. And even I hear too many times that Caltrans isn't afforded the same permitting efficiencies as other restoration partners like Caltrout, or some of the one they see us as orange and them as green for some reason. And so I think more education about the fact that we are doing restoration projects. And I would also contend that some of our bridge replacement projects that aren't fish passage projects, they're betterments, because we're taking bent walls out of the channel, we're spanning rivers and streams more. And so I think how we approach the project when we first engage and initiate with them, we need to start by saying this is a restoration project, and permitting efficiencies should be on the table for us, and not talking about the mitigation word, which I call it the M word, but not talking about mitigation, because the entire project itself is a betterment. And so that's one of the things that we need to work on is educating our partners and getting better at this. The more that my hope is getting better at this, the more that we do it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Town government and then other commission staff or commissioners who would also like to weigh in. Tim?
Sure. Yeah, I was curious about, I was thinking we could put the slide back up. Maybe there's a slide that starts with since 2015, the number of remediated fish barrier locations. It seems like it takes a long time to get these projects done. And, we do coordinate directly with Caltrans as it relates to asset management, state highway system management plan. And I read in there that if based on what it is expected to cost, it'll take Caltrans up to 200 years to be able to remove all the barriers. So a two-part question. One, I'm still kind of fixated on this partial crediting that is being given. I'm just, when you submit your annual report, are they telling you that a partial solution doesn't take it off the list? Like, it seems like I would like to look at that list of 600 or whatever you have and be able to be like, check that one off, like get the list down to as low as possible. So I'm curious about why they're only allowing bridges to be, what did you call it? I think it was full
Full span.
full credit. Is it full credit or is it full solution? Full solution. Yeah. So if they're pushing back, 'cause it seems like sometimes with regulations or regulators, they are trying to push a lot to get the best. And so I'd be curious to know if they're the ones pushing for that. And then the second piece, bridges cost a lot. You kind of mentioned that in your presentation. The cost is pretty pretty large. And so tying onto that partial solution, it seems like to get it more barriers remediated, there are a lot of other options that are out there, and I'm surprised that Caltrans isn't able to get the full solution credit for these other alternatives other than just bridges.
There's still barriers. Those-
Well, I'm just saying, like, I know that my very limited knowledge of fish passage remediation, I know that there's a lot of other solutions that they promote, and for them to not give full credit seems a little bit odd. But my main thing is Caltrans looking at other innovative ways to try and get more barriers remediated, that's maybe cheaper or more time?
The only way to get them removed off the list is to span the entire bed banking channel, the bankable width. That's a full span solution. So anything lesser than that within the trapezoid of the fill prism is a partial barrier or has the potential to become a partial barrier. So it has to be inventoried and monitored and maintained continuously, lest it become a barrier after any given storm event. And so anything lesser than a full span solution requires continuous monitoring, and a full span solution typically requires monitoring for about 5 years to ensure that the channel is adjusted and that there isn't degradation that was unexpected, and then it's checked off the list. And just like any other bridge that would have already spanned the entire channel and not been a barrier to fish. The stream simulation design at this location, this is Little Mill Creek up on it's up on Del Norte 297. And it was a corrugated metal pipe that was put in the 80s. It's actually where ET was part of it was filmed, actually. But a bridge was removed to put in that pipe in the 1980s. And so costs were saved by creating a fish passage barrier. And now a bridge is what was necessary. And so now we've had to remediate that barrier that was created. And that's essentially how a barrier is fully remediated, by getting out of the bed bank and the trapezoid of the channel prism.
Yeah, I'm not a fish bay remediation expert by any means. It just, it seems like bridges would be appropriate in some locations. It just seems, in the past, people have been removing fish barriers for a long time, and bridges cost a lot of money. So it seems like other options would also, remove the barrier.
I think the disconnect is that those partial solutions weren't removing the barrier, that
So
those partial solutions weren't actually removing the barrier.
maybe if I can jump in. I think what I'm hearing from you is that reality is at some point in time, there was nothing that was a barrier to these waterways. And that's the point on where we're starting the question of what's a barrier, what's not a barrier, right? So when we add the culverts, when we add different structures into the trapezoid, as you described, we have created a barrier. The only way to remove that barrier is to take those things out of the waterbed. And that's where we get the full credit, because that's what the resource agencies is looking at when they're talking about how are we mitigating fish passage, how are we ensuring that these critical species are being maintained, right? Thank you.
We did it, we fix it, right? And I hope you know, I love those bridges. And I love the before and after pictures of what we're doing. And the added, treat for us all is that, now they're also multi-purpose. Now we can ride bikes and we can look at all the beautiful landscape, and we're saving the fish. So I love all of that. I'm just hoping we can get to that place where you're talking about educating everyone of let's plan for it. Let's make sure that we're doing all of these things and saying, this is what it's going to cost. It's going to cost $20 bazillion. So let's just put it out there. You have to keep coming back for it, right?
I think for those the locations that are not as important for recovery, some of the solutions that Tim was, some of the stream simulation design solutions where it's we can span the majority of the wetted channel, allow for the natural stream bed, but maybe not span the entire channel, because during that time of year when it wouldn't likely be accessible, might not be as important for that system. And so I do think that when we get lower in the list than of importance, I do think that some of those lesser solutions may be more reasonable and feasible.
But that's too many.
200 years from now, oh,
Speaking to the
I'll be
product
gone.
ones.
I'll be out
That's-
of here.
That's if we remediate 4 locations a year, which was our average for quite a bit of time. But if we remediate more like 10 or 14 locations a year, we're looking at 40 to 50 years.
Do we have other questions or comments from staff or commission?
I guess, just for clarity, my earlier question, and again, this is part of my learning process. How often do projects that come before the commission involve fish barriers that have to be mitigated as part of the project? And so then they're paid for by the applicant. Does that come up? And I'm just curious, I know you're talking about independently dealing with these barriers, but I'm just curious how often they're dealt with as part of the process of dealing with over, larger projects.
Do you mean shop projects or STIP projects?
All of the above.
The Santa Barbara HOV project is that STIP project is remediating some barriers along that section. So sometimes partners do, if they're, doing work, on the state highway system, they do have to remediate barriers if it's within their. And so Santa Barbara is in that STIP project is remediating some
It would
barriers.
be part of the environmental impact review, the
Yes.
EIR process to mitigate that.
They do consider it mitigation in some instances. In fact, there was a bill that was passed, SB 790 last year, that allows for, in some instances, mitigation credits for connectivity projects. So there may be an instance where a larger project, like a drainage project or a repaving, rerouting project, may use either fish or wildlife connectivity as its on-site mitigation. That could be possible.
Thank you.
Executive Director Taylor, any questions or comments? I do have a couple of questions then, Melinda, that haven't been covered yet. If we could go back to Melinda's slide 16, please. Thanks for your patience with. Oh, okay. It said 116. It was a map of the state of California. There was a earlier map that showed where the salmon and steelhead domain or population centers were. And then there was this much bigger map of partners,
Right.
which covers a lot more of California than where the salmon and steelhead seem to be in the other map. Help me to understand.
You are correct. This map is demonstrating the district area more so than the species area. So these are in the Central Valley, our Marysville District 3, Stockton District 10, and our Fresno District 6 are all a part of that, but very little of our District 6 is in salmon and steelhead area. They have a very slight portion of, I think, Madera County and just a tiny bit of Fresno that was historic, but they're extirpated from that area. And so you're correct. Most of that area doesn't have salmon and steelhead. Almost everything out, east of the valley, there are no salmon and steelhead in the Sierra Nevada. There's landlocked kokanee and landlocked rainbow trout.
Great, thank you. And from this slide, if we move forward 5 to 1-21, there is a bridge that we see from this angle where the past chair Eager asked if bike and ped could cross that. You said yes. I can't tell if that's a bridge that also accommodates vehicles other than bike ped or if it's narrower than that.
It does have shoulders and sidewalks on it. It was brought to standard in 2014, but it's in a very rural area. It's right next to a campground. So it's a very rural 2 lanes. I think it has 8-foot shoulders on it. And I'm not sure if it does have sidewalks because there's just not a lot of pedestrians there.
Okay.
But it definitely accommodates the safety required shoulders of today's standards.
Good. Thank you. The other question, we don't need to go to a slide. Thank you. Appreciate you. I know she was. Was the legislative process, the original legislation about 15 years ago, and one of the portions of that legislation was an annual report to the legislature. Is that something that is just accomplished in writing? Is that in writing and then proactive outreach to legislators, to the appropriate committees authorizing and appropriations of jurisdiction? Tell us about that process of how you meet not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of truly communicating with the legislators.
Sure. So I have been the principal author to 11 reports to legislature now for fish passage. And so internally, our legislative affairs obviously works with us throughout the writing of the legislative report. And then once our director approves of it now goes to the governor. And that's kind of a newer thing that wasn't happening before. And an agency, of course, and then to the legislature. And if they ask to meet with us, we do meet with them. And typically it's the Fisheries and Aquaculture Committee. Senator McGuire has been chairing that for quite a long time now. And yeah, so we haven't, I think it's been a couple of years since we've been questioned on the report. Legislature hasn't I think they had noticed that we were doing more and more over time. And so we've received less questions.
First, thanks for doing that, both reactively and proactively. Tough budget year. I know that's breaking news to everyone. How is this impacting your program, if at all?
I think we'll know in the 2025 SHS&P. We're just working on our inventory right now and updating our cost estimate. So through that analysis, we'll find out if our program, if we get some funding or, how that breaks. But I'm curious as well.
Melinda, thanks again for coming all the way down. A great presentation and very important work for our state. I'm going to give people one more chance. And then any closing remarks that Melinda would like to make. So is there anyone here physically present that still has a question or a comment? Okay. Virtually, is there anyone with a question or a comment?
I see no requests from any of our virtual attendees.
Thank you. From staff or commissioners, questions, comments? Melinda, any closing remarks?
I just thank you for your time today and all your great questions, and that this is something that you care about. Thank you.
Thank you. As our executive director mentioned, this hearing tomorrow and the next day of our commission has 163 book items, about 1,500 pages of material. We would never have been able to invest a full hour on this one topic. So I'm so glad we're doing this. Thank you again to our team for teeing up the opportunity for Melinda to educate us more fully, as well as our stakeholders. And we still have two really important reports to go through as well.
If I could just say, I appreciate, sorry. I just happened to ask the question, what's up with the fish passages? So this was much more than I had expected. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Past Chair Eager. Melinda, great job. Will you join me in thanking Melinda for her report? We are going to move forward then, Timothy, if that's okay with you, with the geotechnical site characterization, overview of how Caltrans performs and determines site conditions. Nina Choi. Nina, thank you for joining us today. And we'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Oh, I was just going to add, thank you. That's no problem. Thank you, Chair Gardino. I was just going to add, this topic is here also due to some questions that have been coming to the commission, mainly for supplemental funds to complete construction with reasons related to geotech differences at the site. There have also been some commissioner questions asking if Caltrans is seeing a statewide uptick on issues related to geotech and if Caltrans is making progress improvements to address the trend the commission is noticing. Nina Choi, Caltrans Chief of Geotechnical Services in the Division of Engineering Services, is here to provide a presentation on how Caltrans performs geotechnical studies and determines geotechnical site conditions, which Chair Gardino already covered, but I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners, for having me here today. So yes, today what I aim to do is just give an overview of how Caltrans performs and determines site conditions for our transportation projects. So this is actually a photo of one of our drill crews at Echo Summit. And what we wanted to convey with this photo is just to get an idea, give you all an idea of some of the terrain that we wind up having to do some of our work on. A drill crew will consist of 3 vehicles. There's a tender vehicle, there's a crew cab, and then there's the drill rig itself. And so when you have as many vehicles as we do on a project, part of what we need to be looking for is also traffic management, traffic control. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the logistical challenges as well as part of this presentation. Next slide, please. So the objectives today and what I'll go over is hopefully I will be able to convey and give you a better understanding of the geotechnical process, the types of site condition challenges that we can encounter on projects, how we are managing risk at geotechnical services, and then some of the efforts that we are undertaking for continual improvement. Next slide. So first thing when we get a project and we're asked to perform a site investigation is we'll do what we call a desktop site investigation plan. And so basically what this entails is we're going to review everything that we can find that's existing. Existing records, including maps from the U.S. Geological Survey. That's a huge resource for us. We can look at existing literature with regards to the site. We will also do a site visit, take a look at the geology, take a look at where the best places to perhaps take a boring are, what are some geologic or site specific constraints that we may encounter. We also look at what's called a log of test borings, if this is in a existing structure. Caltrans and Geotechnical Services, we have a database of existing and previous projects. So we can take a look at, if there was a previous alignment and maybe there was a log of test borings that was done years ago initially. So we'll use that and take a look at other reports that we can have at our disposal. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to focus a little bit on borings because borings are one of the main ways that we're able to characterize the ground. There are a couple other ways, which I'll discuss in some subsequent slides. But one of the big things that we're going to try to determine is the number of borings, the locations of the borings, and the depths of those borings. And so we use a lot of guidance as a starting point. The first place that we will look is the AASHTO guidance. So under the bridge design specifications, section 10.4.2, subsurface exploration, for different types of structures, this document, which is used by all DOT states that are part of AASHTO, it gives a recommended number of borings for the type of structure and basically a depth. We'll also take a look at these USGS maps and existing information that we have on that site to determine depths as well, as I stated previously. Now, we also have internal guidance at Caltrans and Geotechnical Services that gives us further guidelines with regards to how we plan the borings. Now, we do take into account when there are site-specific limitations. And sometimes those risks do pay off for us, and sometimes they don't. So for instance, for a sound wall in a very homogeneous area, we may not take as many borings. And that's something that we do quite frequently. But in some instances where maybe we are running into environmental issues or environmental clearance issues, we may not be able to take the number of borings that we originally anticipated. And then we have to take a risk and maybe decrease the number of borings and do some interpolation on our end. Next slide, please. So I'll walk you through this slide because it's not very self-explanatory. This is our site ready to drill process. And this kind of outlines from the minute we get a request to get a foundation report, which is then used by our bridge designers to come up with their design, to the point where we actually start drilling. This is a process from start to finish, and there's actually several steps. So it starts with bridge design in Caltrans asking geotechnical services for a foundation report. That triggers this site investigation plan. This is the initial site investigation plan that I referred to, I believe, on slide 3. Once Caltrans does the site investigation plan, we determine the type of investigation that's needed and the layout of these planned borings. We'll also plan the types and the locations of the types of tests that we're going to do. Our geoprofessionals will determine access routes, see if there's any utilities, just basically what does this site look like. Once they do that, we move on to the next box where there's a site assessment questionnaire. And that is something that we put together for our district partners. This is the box that probably takes the longest time. This is where we are looking at trying to obtain our environmental permits and getting our right-of-way clearances. Sometimes we aren't able to take borings in our immediate right-of-way. So we need to work with our right-of-way agents and Caltrans to get that completed. Depending on where the location is, we're dealing with several different agencies that may need to give us environmental permits. We will be working sometimes with Department of Water Resources, could be Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, other maybe up in the North region, maybe we're working with tribes. There's also other anthropological, paleological considerations, the railroads as well. So I think the key point with this middle box is we're working with external agencies that sometimes aren't on the same timeline as we are. And the number of permits that are required could add to the time required to obtain these permits. Once we obtain these permits, then we put together a preliminary drill request package to our drill crews. This includes lane closure charts. This is where we would coordinate with, say, our maintenance counterparts in the districts for traffic control activities. We would also have to get a well permit from the local enforcement agency. So there's another permit that we need to obtain. That geotech we will approach our counterparts in the counties. And I think there's like 93 counties or something throughout the state, and each county has their own requirements when asking for a well permit. So we obtain the well permit. Once we get all that, we get our clearances, we call dig alert, we have our site safety plan. Now we're good to go, and we can finally get our drill crew to the site and start drilling. Now, the best case scenario is this entire process takes 3 to 4 months. The average scenario is between 6 and 9 months. And what the worst case scenario is, we have seen this process take between 12 and 36 months. And that's typically for very complex projects where there's a lot of permits required. Now, where we got these numbers, we did an internal audit in geotechnical services of about 18 projects statewide. And we found that the worst case scenario was only about 2 of those projects. So about 10% of the projects that we audited kind of fell into that worst case category. Next slide, please. So I just kind of wanted to delve a little bit more into the planning for site conditions and some of the complexities that we run into in geotechnical services. So like I mentioned, we do a research of the site, both past and present. Those include the as-built data, geology maps. And the image that I have here is a geologic map of California. And off to the side, I know you probably can't read everything, but all the different colors is a different type of geologic condition. And so you can see in some areas in California, there's very different geologies that lie right next to each other. And that is one of the challenges that we in geotechnical services do have to contend with. Some of the projects that have come to the CTC, there are very different site conditions right next to each other. You can have sand right next to an igneous rock. And so so that's the trick, and it's one of the things that we in geotech try to plan for, and if we can't, we try to make sure that we're identifying those as risks. I did also mention that we do drilled borings. We also have cone penetrometer testing. It's where we take a cone and a rod and we kind of push it into the ground, and it can give us a little bit of an idea of the type of soil that we're running into below that location. It's got different limitations though than borings and probably can't go as deep. We also use seismic refraction, and we also take a look at existing groundwater elevations. So seismic refraction is we lay out sensors along the road or along the right of way, and we'll induce a charge. Just like it sounds, seismic, we're measuring the sound, and we can tell a little bit more data about the soil and the ground that we're dealing with. Some physical challenges that we have to borings. Sometimes we run into very steep and mountainous terrain. We've had to helicopter in a drill rig to certain locations before. Sometimes if it's on a very steep slope, we don't have the ability maybe to drill directly in that area. So we might have to go maybe 50 feet or a certain amount of feet off to the side where we actually can access it a little bit more. I talked a little bit about the highly variable geology in California. And then the logistical administrative challenges that we have to drilling borings, the environmental clearances and the permits, the categorical exemptions and exclusions, sometimes getting the lane closures that we need. We will do night work. And then again, the well drilling and permits and the different local enforcement agencies. Next slide. So these are all different types of differing site conditions that we can run into. So I wanted to put this slide on here because differing site conditions is such a broad term, and just under that particular term, we have run into different things. Sometimes there's man-made buried objects that we don't know are there. We have unanticipated boulders and cobbles. We actually just recently ran into a project that you may hear about tomorrow, Point Magoo down on Pacific Coast Highway, where we ran into rock. We thought it was bedrock. Turns out it's probably rock from Pacific Coast Highway's construction years ago when they blasted through. We sometimes run into caving soils, which we didn't anticipate when we did the log of test borings. And so when they start driving piles, the soil's it's starting to cave in on itself. We may run into unanticipated groundwater. The fluctuations that we've had with the climate have sometimes the groundwater is higher, sometimes it's lower than we thought it was. Again, we have complex geology, sometimes shear zones, faults, different bedding contacts. The rock is too hard or the rock matrix is too weak. And what that means is, even though the log of test borings has told us this is the type of rock that we've run into, it's just a snapshot. A boring is only about 3 to 4 inches in diameter. And it's not telling us if that particular rock formation has several fractures in it that maybe is going to affect construction in the field. Inadequate bearing capacity is something that we have run into as well. The geology that we encountered at the site doesn't match the boring logs. Sometimes that happens when we're doing foundations maybe 50 feet or something away from where we took the original borings. And then at times we do run into contaminated groundwater. However, if that's the case, district environmental, they take the lead on that. Next slide.
Nina, before you leave that slide, if I may just ask a clarifying question.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm thinking of a recent item that we dealt with near Angels Camp on Highway 4, where improvements on that roadway, we ran across indigenous burial remains. I don't see that on there. Does that fall under man-made buried objects, or is that a different category?
I would categorize that under man-made buried objects.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, next slide. Oh, thank you. So when we're managing risk on a project from a geotechnical standpoint, a lot of it has to do with cost and with time. For instance, if we look at drilling takes time to get the permits. It could take time to do the drilling operation itself. So if I were to put rough estimates on things, it could take, depending on the type of geology that we're drilling through, 2 to 3 days or 2 to 4 days to do one boring. If it's very soft material, we might be able to do it in 1 day. It also depends on how far down and how deep we're doing those borings. And so we're also looking at cost to mobilize a drill rig and have a well drilling certified inspector on site, traffic control, all of the things that are required to get a drill rig out there. We're looking at around $200,000 a week for a crew to get 3 borings. And so sometimes that does play into the decisions that are made by the team, by the project development team. Also contributing to cost and time is maybe the amount of time it might be taking to get an environmental permit or to get permits done. And so there might be a decision made that, in the interest of cost and time, we may change the original plan. Sometimes this comes up as part of a value engineering change proposal. And one of the key things that I want to make sure that I convey is we want to make sure that this is put in the project risk register. So when we make these decisions, we're trying to manage our risk. We're taking an educated risk here. And so that needs to be documented in the risk register. Some examples that we have, environmental right-of-way restrictions that require geotech services to extrapolate that happened to us on Trancas Creek, where we were not able to obtain permits easily in the creek, in the middle of the creek. And so we took borings at the abutment locations and tried to interpolate between those two. It was a calculated risk, didn't work out the way we thought it was going to, but it was something that as a team, we all thought that was the best course of action based on the information we had at the time. And then sometimes there are late project changes. You might have changes to the design, changes to the alignment. When things like that happen, it also decreases the amount of time that we may have to take borings or to adjust the boring plan. Now, some examples of situations where we take a calculated risk and it actually works out well for us are, say, overhead sign structures, sound walls, and culverts. So very often, if we have a culvert project, instead of taking, it's just not cost effective to take a boring at every culvert location. So we might take it maybe one every 3. Same thing with sound walls. And especially if we know that in an area where the geology is fairly homogeneous, like the Central Valley, we will often take less borings. And those have typically worked out for us in the past. Sign structures is also another one, especially when you're dealing with being right in the middle of maybe a freeway. It also decreases exposure to traffic. Next slide, please. So I do want to make sure that I address the improvements and the continual improvement that geotech services is undergoing. We do try to learn from what's happened in the past. One of the things that we have implemented in our organization is we have a quality management system that is based on ISO 9001. And so part of that requires us to make sure that, one, we have all of our processes documented. Those processes and our guidance are reviewed on a regular basis and updated on a regular basis. And also that we perform lessons learned and root cause analysis when we have projects that don't go quite the way we thought it was going to do, so we can learn from them. So some of the things that we have updated, and when I say module, our guidance is broken up into chapters. So we have chapters on how to evaluate dewatering. This is for the geotechnical professionals, or how we deal with collapsible soils and identify collapsible soils. And if we have structures that are below grade, here are some of the considerations as an engineer you need to make sure that you look at when you are planning for these projects. So these are it's just a small example of some of the modules that we've recently updated based off of some of the lessons that we've learned from projects. The other final thing that we have implemented is project risk management training in our organization. So all of our lead geoprofessionals have gone through project risk management training, and we've emphasized the importance of making sure that risk is documented and communicated very early on in the project and throughout the life of that project, so we can continue to keep an eye on things as things change, because geology can be dynamic. Next slide. I'm available to take any questions and have any further discussion if you'd like.
Nina, thank you for joining us today and for the excellent presentation. We will do the same in terms of comments and questions And we're going to start with our guests in the room. Again, thanks to Douglas, we'll have a 3-minute timer so that we have a chance for everyone and anyone who would like to be heard. So are there guests in the room who would like to make comments or ask questions to Nina? Okay. Thank you. Is there anyone virtually participating that would like to ask questions?
We do not see any requests from any of our virtual attendees.
Great. Thank you. Let's go to our staff and commissioners then. Tim, I see you leaning in.
Thank you, Chair Gardino. I first want to just express my appreciation for the high-level overview of how you get to your geotechnical studies and what it takes to get there. I think that's an important element to the decisions that you're making as it relates to the work being done during pre-construction and the risks that you take going to construction. I think you've done a great job of explaining that, and I mostly appreciate the slide that talks about your kind of the follow-up lessons learned that you're learning from some of these to see if there's any areas that can be adjusted so that we aren't seeing the large increases. Because it seems like of the supplementals we've seen, they've been large, whereas um, in other cases it may not be as noticeable. But going forward, maybe we'll see less. We'll have the ability to understand now what it takes to get there and like the basis to which you guys came to that conclusion going out to construction. So I don't have a specific question.
Oh, Tim, thank you for the comment. And I should note for our minutes as well that past Chair Hillary Norton joined us before Nina started with her presentation. Past Chair Norton, thank you for participating today remotely. And I see that our immediate past Chair, Leanne Eager, has questions and comments, please. Okay, forgive me. We will share. We'll show that we're good at sharing.
So, and I don't remember the name of the creek that you said. I tried to move around Douglas. That's why I moved down there because I couldn't see it around. Kept going back and forth. I don't remember which creek project you were talking about, but you said we all got together and said, okay, this is the best direction we go in, and then it wasn't. So for that particular one, maybe you can explain to us what that process was and then what you learned from that particular project.
Yeah, so that was the Trancas Creek project down by Malibu. And the big challenge for us on that particular project was the environmental clearances to get into the middle of the creek. The new bridge that was to be constructed would have a pier in the middle of the bridge. But because of the environmental clearances, we weren't able to get in there at the time. So what we did is we took the borings, we talked to the project development team. We said, what we can do is take borings on either side of the abutment and maybe another one later on down, take a look at that geologic profile and maybe just interpolate what we think that profile will look like. And turns out what we didn't anticipate, and sometimes there are things that we just can't anticipate geologically. We didn't anticipate that there was an ancient creek bed underneath that creek. And so the soil, the geology was a lot softer than what we thought we would normally run into with a creek bed. So lesson learned for that one is, maybe in the future we try to start the environmental process a little bit earlier. But from a geologic perspective, there wasn't a whole lot on our end that we thought that could have been done differently other than trying to get that permit to get the boring.
Executive Director Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. So we often hear from our project sponsors about working with the railroads, and you mentioned that part of your development process is working with railroads because of right-of-way concerns or other things. Are there places where you have success stories or growth edges or areas for growth that you can talk about from your process that throughout our project sponsors can learn from? And if not, you can share those later. It doesn't have to be right now, but that's kind of a question that I'm trying to understand is Are there areas where we're having successes with railroads that we can share with our partner agencies? Are there areas where we're having challenges or areas for growth, and how are we overcoming some of those?
Okay. And I can think of them a little bit more, but I know that one of the things that we do have to do when we are working with the railroads is you have to go through training through the railroads, right, to work in their particular right of way. And if we're able to um, consolidate that training, so we're maybe not doing it kind of piecemeal. So for instance, we just ran into a project where geotech get our drillers out on the right of way to do this project. We had to go get the training. It was not as easy as we thought it was. Turns out our district partners were like, hey, you could have piggybacked with us, right? So that was kind of a communication issue on our end. Um, but knowing that now, we can probably consolidate our efforts going forward. So that's one example.
And yes, please, Commissioner.
I need a better understanding is how your work, how do you collaborate with a contractor on a project like this? You do um, pre-project borings and you do borings during the course of the project. Does the contractor that's involved that works in partnership with you, do they do borings as well? And forgive my ignorance, I'm still learning how all this works, but I'm just curious how that works.
They can. And so let me take a step back and go back to Trancas, because one of the lessons learned that we had with Trancas, because we couldn't get in before the project started, when we did the other, forget which side we did first, northbound or southbound. But when we did the southbound, and when we started construction, that's when we did the borings. We were able, because we had the clearances to do the construction, right? So we were able to do borings in the middle of the creek then, and that's where we learned this is how far we need to go. So that when we did the other side, we didn't have the same issue with regards to the piling. So I use that as an example because in that case, I think I want to say that case, we actually did the borings, but we have worked in the past with the contractor, and the contractor can bring on a subcontractor to do borings as well. So in Point Magoo, when we had a CMGC project, we did a number of borings, Caltrans did, and then the contractor came in with their own drill crews, consultant drill crews, and did additional borings.
And I guess the concern, my understanding is the concern here is there's these supplemental costs that come in,
Mhm.
some cases very large costs. When is the contractor take responsibility for cost increases? Does that ever happen, or is that always considered a change? Because if they're doing borings themselves and they go out to bid based on their conclusions, based on your conclusions, when is it not the responsibility of the I guess the applicant to have to pay supplemental, or does that ever happen?
So I'm probably not going to answer your question as fully as you'd like, but I'll try the best that I can. Normally, we try to provide as much geotechnical subsurface investigation before the project goes out to bid, so that a contractor does not have to do any drilling during the construction phase. In the extenuating circumstances where drilling is performed by the contractor during the construction phase, usually that's a construction administration question, and I'm not as familiar with how to answer that. Sometimes it's included in a CCO. It could be included in G12. I would have to find out a little bit more about that and get back to you.
But generally, the contractor is reliant on your borings,
Correct.
the Caltrans borings. So if they run into something that's different than that, that's on Caltrans essentially, is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give one more round in case anything that you heard prompted others. So guests in the room, anyone would like to comment or ask a question? Virtual guests?
Not seeing any request at this time.
Great. That's why we do
All right,
this.
I do see that we have one virtual attendee with their hand raised at this time. I'd like to call on Martha Armis Kelly.
Hi, I just wanted to say you've far exceeded my expectations as far as your thoroughness and the information that you've given. I would wonder if this would be something that we could revisit at a later date, or is this is the final report for the year, or are you going to come back and report back to us, like let us know how the fish have survived and how some of these projects have evolved?
Martha, thank you so much. And if you didn't know, Martha is our amazing vice chair of our Equity Advisory Committee as well. So thank you for participating today. Today is our project development workshop that we do periodically where we can really dive into issues. So follow-up questions you may want to, on this item, reach out directly to Nina Choi, or on the issues around steelhead and salmon, reach out directly to Melinda, if that's okay with them. And probably working through Tim Sobelman on our team would be a great way to reach others. Does that sound acceptable, Martha? I think we may have lost her. Thank you, though, for participating. Commissioner, colleagues, or staff, any other final questions for Nina? Nina, you get a chance for any wrap-up remarks you'd like to make.
No, I just, again, thank you for the time to present and just give a little bit more understanding about some of the things that you may be seeing. And if you have any additional questions with regards to what we do here in Geotech, I'm more than happy to assist.
Great. Nina, my only question was going to be that first slide with the 3 different big pieces of equipment. May my 7-year-old come out and climb all over them? Because he would really like to.
Well, if you ever want to see or get on any of our drill rigs,
There
more
you
than
go.
happy to
There you
accommodate.
go. The joy of being chair. This is wonderful. Hey, for the last hour and 40 minutes. Yes, please. Nina, thank you. For the last hour and 45 minutes, we've been stretching our minds. I think it's time that we have an opportunity to be stretching our legs. So it is 2:43. We're going to come back, if it's okay with Tim Sobelman, at 3 p.m. Great. Thank you all. We're both going
I'm just saying.
Right.
Get them all out. Good.
What is our response to theirs? I don't know. Yeah. I haven't, right? No. Ours is. I know you Yes.
Thanks, Tim. And good afternoon, Commissioners and Chair Gardino. Welcome to your new position. I do very much appreciate the opportunity to come and discuss the Q2 project delivery report for this current fiscal year, 23-24. Next slide, please. What I plan to cover today is the following: how we ended Q2, which was December 31st of 2023, and how we did in the delivery of our various milestones. I also want to talk on the current status of our delivery, and then what we are seeing in the current bidding environment. I always like to cover the bidding environment, as we tend to see a lot of supplementals and greater than 120s that come in during the commission meeting. And I think you getting eyes on what we're seeing in terms of trends and things like that help in making those decisions. So I do ask that you remember some of the information. I do spew a lot of data, so I apologize in advance. But if you can remember some of the data come Friday when we're looking at those supplementals and greater than 120s. Next slide. So now it begins, the big tables. This is how we ended Q2 for 23-24. So this data is as of December 31st of 2023. For each of the milestones that we track, which are the draft environmental document. You may hear me refer to that as DED, because we do love our acronyms as well. Project approval and environmental document. Yeah. And then we have PA&ED, which is the project approval and environmental document. We have the project certified for right-of-way, which we tend to call right-of-way certification or right-of-way cert. We have projects designed and ready for construction, which you'll usually hear me refer to that as RTL, or ready to list. And then projects constructed. And those are projects in which the construction is complete and accepted, or CCA. So if you look at the table, you can see that even though we're 50% done with the fiscal year, we have more than 50% of the milestones to finish delivering for the second quarter. The same goes for our planned capital value for delivery as well, which is this really tied to those projects that are designed and ready for construction. When they make RTL, then we can count that dollar value is going to be going to construction. So if the RTLs are low, those projects going to construction, that value is going to be a little bit low as well. Our year-end forecast, you can see, is still pretty positive at the end of Q2. That is because, as we tend to be, we're still taking risks, we're still working through those challenges, and we're still maintaining the pressure on our delivery teams to make our commitments. Next slide. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me as I go. I'm okay with that. So for the next two slides, I want to be able to show you how the current Q2 for the current fiscal year looks compared to the last 4 quarters, and how at those same years we ended in the delivery of the milestones for those years. So the idea here is to show that even with many of the milestones left to complete, the progress that we have left is not a straight line projection on how we end the fiscal year. We tend to end higher than a straight line projection would give us. So getting into it a little bit, I'm going to share some of the general challenges we're seeing with all of our milestones, and I'll also provide some specific challenges with each milestone as we go through it. So one of the largest general challenges that we're seeing, and Nina touched on this, is staffing changes. We're seeing a high level of attrition. We've been seeing that over the past few years, which means we've got vacancies that we're filling, and we've got new staff coming on board. So we've got, if you will, knowledge leaving, and then inexperience coming in. What we're doing to address that is we are working on improving our training modules across the state. We've got a very robust project delivery professional development program in which all of the functional units provide subject matter expertise and provide training for new staff. We have a lot of on-the-job training also going on, in which we've got our senior staff working with the newer staff to try to do some knowledge transfer. But the challenge is, even as new staff are coming in, they don't have some of that experience when they're coming up against a risk or a challenge. They may not even recognize it and they may go through. And so that does tend to get seen as delays in project delivery.
Was this one of those issues you want us to remember for tomorrow?
Might be.
Yeah.
And we like to say challenge. So starting with DED or DED, as you can see, we tend to hover between 20 to 40% in our completion over the years in Q2. The average, if you were to do the math, is about 29%. However, we end up ending those years anywhere between 59 and 76. The average is about 66%. And those are the draft environmental documents. So those are very early in the phase 0, if you will. For PA&ED, which is the next step in the delivery process, we tend to hover between 25%, which this year is the low, to about 54% of completion in Q2. The average is about 38% when you do the math. And we end the years typically, though, within the 85 to 91%. So we do a lot of gains there. One of the reasons why we get that sharp jump is we will find there's environmental documents that end up being not as complicated that we end up claiming victory for, if you will. So we've put them on the list as a environmental assessment or a higher level document. They come in as a CECE. So they come in as a lower level document, which means we can get through them quicker. So that tends to drive the spike at the end of the the end of the fiscal year. The other thing that tends to drive that jump is we're getting the project reports that are currently in their draft stages and getting circulated for comments and finalized. Once that's all done, all that it takes to get the finalization is a signature. And so you'll get a large jump in those that happen at the end of the year as well. Some of the specific challenges that we see with those two milestones are we are seeing some scope changes occur during the project approval and environmental document phase. As we're meeting with our partners, we want to be good partners. We are seeing some scope changes in which they want us to put some scope into projects. That may cause some redesign. It may cause a delay as we add that to the environmental document project report. The other thing that we've been seeing, especially within the last year, is as funding opportunities have come up, IIJA probably being the largest of those, is we are trying to maximize our use of those funding dollars, which are very limited in terms of time. And so we've been applying those to existing projects. And as we do that, we've had to, again, modify some of the designs, which has made some delays. Now, I will say the goal as we're putting those together is to identify projects that maybe already had that scope and then do a funding swap, budgetary thing, but that's not always been possible. And so, especially when we're trying to be a little more equitable in how we spread those dollars availability across districts. So you may have something within one district that could take care of all of that, but then you'd be leaving the other districts out. So we've been trying to spread that across districts. Also, there's sometimes unforeseen triggers that happen when we make that change. Next slide. So looking at projects designed and ready for construction, you'll note I skipped over the certified for right-of-way. Part of that is, well, it's mostly due to they've got a lot of identical patterning in which the graphs look. And that's because you can't achieve RTL without getting the right-of-way cert, and they occur very close to each other in the project schedule. So if there's delays in right-of-way cert, you'll see it in RTL. So we do a lot of work in quarters 3 and 4, especially quarters 4 in the last year, last couple of years. And you've probably seen that in the previous reports. So in terms of what we're seeing on the graphs, we hover between the low 16% for this year to 24% completion in quarter 2. That gives us an average of about 22%. but we do end up ending the years anywhere between 79 to 92%. The last couple of years, it's been on the lower end, but the average is about 87%. Um, we're working on several strategies for moving delivery out of that fourth quarter and for it to be more spread or balanced, if you will. And one of those you will see during the commission meeting tomorrow or Friday, in which we're bringing 46 of the new shop projects forward for simultaneous allocation. So we're not only adopting the shop, but we're allocating those 46 projects early for PA&ED or at that same meeting so that we can begin our spring biological surveys an entire year earlier. If we were to wait until July to allocate that, we would miss this spring to do some biological surveys. So we'd have to wait an entire year to do that. It's a pilot project. We're going to be doing some metrics on what kind of accelerations we can see if we specifically chose the 46 projects based on their delivery time. And we're hoping to, again, pull those out of the fourth quarter and get those delivered earlier in the fiscal years. We're also asking our project delivery teams to re-examine the downstream impacts that they see during delays. So if you are delaying a PA&ED, that will cause a domino effect for your right-of-way cert or your RTL because you've still got your designs to do, you've got your permitting to get. And we don't control the external durations for the permitting. So if they're not cognizant of what that PA&ED impact may be, and they're not shifting the entire schedule to try to hold that RTL, because they all want to make the RTLs. It's very important for them. Sometimes it ends up providing a constraint to the permitting duration that we don't control. So it ends up having that domino effect down the road. We're also working to mitigate the following challenges. Like I said, we don't control the permitting agencies, and we have had some permitting agencies that have changed course midstream in terms of what they're requiring for our permits. We've been doing this so long that a lot of times we look at our permitting or our processes as a status quo. We know what the process is because we've been doing it for years. So we're not always meeting with them as early as we should. So one of the things we're asking our project delivery teams to do is don't assume the status quo anymore. When you know you're going to have a permit with an agency, go talk to them. Let them know this is coming in. Make sure that we understand if a process has changed. We also have to deal with utility companies, but they have their own priorities, whether that's mitigating for wildfire, their own undergrounding, that type of thing. And so what we're doing in that area is we are having coordination meetings with utility companies in some of the districts, meeting with them because it's kind of a two-way street. They are coming in with projects that need encroachment permits onto our highway system. We also need permits from them. What we're finding is those aren't always the same sides of the house. So we're trying to make sure that we're coordinating with the right folks and getting them on board as well. And then lastly, what we've seen this year in particular is, and I think this has to do with the way we're scoping some of our projects, we're trying to do a lot more with the complete streets. We're putting sidewalks in, we're doing curb ramps. What that tends to drive, though, is there's a lot of right-of-way work that's involved with that. So we've got a spike in right-of-way work right now, whether it's for temporary construction easements or small construction takes or right-of-way perfection that we have to do on our right-of-way. And so we've got a very high workload that's coming in. What we're doing for that is we are working to procure some contracts, some professional services contracts to try to assist with that workload spike. The other thing that we are doing is we are prioritizing some projects to focus on delivery of this year and doing a specific identification of projects that might be better to actually delay to the next fiscal year. So kind of planned delays, if you will. Those will trigger the time extensions. We know that. But it really helps balance that workload within the staffing that we have. final graph on here is the projects being constructed. You can see that again, it's a downward trend from 32% this year to 61% for Q2. Average with that trend is about 46% that we're constructing in Q2. But we've been ending the years anywhere between 86 and 61%. That average is about 79. I'm hoping we'll be above that this year. What we've been seeing, some of the challenges, is the longer durations at award. I think the last meetings, we've seen several supplementals for award come in. That means that we're delaying that award timing. And if we're delaying that award timing, then they're not getting into construction when we want. So sometimes that's pushing the construction completion, of course, out across the fiscal year. It's more of a domino effect. So I'm hoping as we mitigate the earlier delays, we'll see that increase as well. The other thing that we are seeing, and this is a communication education thing with our districts, is we're not seeing the plant establishment period always being accommodated when they're coming in and asking for the allocations. And so they're not accounting for that in their completion schedules. And plant establishment can last anywhere between 1 year to 5 years. So we're asking our PDTs to really get engaged and make sure that you're accounting for everything that's going to happen in construction when you're putting your schedules together. Other two things that we've had is we did have some logistics issues in getting material procurements for some of the materials beginning of the year. I think we're through that. The other thing that we saw, brought it up before other years, storms. When the winter storms come in, we'll have increased rain day delays. That'll end up causing maybe some CCOs even, and then pushing projects out. Next slide, please. So that's how Q2 was. So where are we at as of today? When I mean as of today, it's Saturday when I was putting the slide deck together. So as of March 16th, this is where we were. You can see we've continued to make progress. Almost all the milestones are now about 40% of completion. RTL is still lagging, but again, I know the districts are working hard to make those Q4 deliveries. We have a lot going on in Q4. It's something that we knew was a risk as we're moving things around. We are doing our best to try to make those. Before I get into the bidding environment, be the next thing. Any questions on our deliveries?
I do have a question. So as you're doing this analysis of, how are we doing this year as compared to years past, are the CMGC contracts, are you looking at, are they doing better now that we're using more of those? Or does that fall into any of these categories of, jury's still out?
Right. No. So for CMGCs, we use the same milestones, but the procurement process is a little bit different. So you can do your early work packages, which gets some of that work out on the street earlier than expected. I don't have all of the data on it, but I believe what we've seen in terms of the completion of those CMGC projects is those are hitting their schedules. So for the limited amount that we've got on them in terms of schedule, I think they're doing okay. I know.
How about cost?
On the cost side, that's one of the things that's driving some of the greater than 120s that are coming in. So, and I'll get into what I'm seeing in the costs a little bit later in the presentation, and we can address it there. But one of the things that CMGC contractors do when we're providing that is we have our engineer's estimate. They have their contract estimate, which they've got a little bit better understanding of their materials and means. They're also not a low bid construction contractor. They're a best value type. So you're not with the competition that you may see in a low bid environment.
It's not really apples to apples.
Right.
Because sometimes they bring in more innovation too, which is going to cost more and may take longer. So I'm just wondering if we've done that analysis yet.
It's still being done.
Okay.
Commissioner Tiffany, you had a clarifying question as well?
Yeah, I do. You mentioned early on, staff issues and, I come from San Diego County, a small, rural county, and we certainly struggled with staff problems that affected our ability to deal with roads. We lost a lot of people to private contractors that pay more, and often benefits are significantly higher than what we as a county can afford. I'm curious, are you dealing with some of the same issues at the state level? And if so, how do you address that? Because that is a huge problem for us in a county.
Yeah. And it is, and the thing is, we're all competing for the same people, whether it's state, whether it's federal, whether it's our consulting contracts. And so what we are doing, our HR department is doing some very robust spring recruitments. They're actually gearing up for now. We're going to college campuses. We're basically hitting the pavement, doing meet and greets with students. We're trying to get everybody interested to come work for us. We've had pretty good success with those now that we've got a rhythm to it, if you will. So we just got done with a fall one. We're going back in spring. We're going to go back in fall so that we have a continual presence on college campuses so that we can try to drive those new engineers and non-engineers even, because we have other classifications that we need to hire, drive those into our ranks.
Do you have the ability to increase the level of pay or benefits? I know, again, you run into problems with that because
It's all collective bargaining.
it's very difficult. I
Yeah.
realize that. So basically, you have the same problem that we all have.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And sometimes, Commissioner Tiffany, they steal our employees. Caltrans does. Just saying.
Oh, and sometimes as I look over to my right, you will steal our employees as well.
No. We recruit yours. You steal
Oh.
ours.
Touche. So now that I'm through the delivery, if we go to the next slide, I'll get into the bidding environment. And as I said, I do feel this is valuable for the commissioners to understand so that you can see what we face as our projects go out to bid. And I'm going to mention this a little later, but I'm going to mention it now as well. One thing to keep in mind is when we do our engineer's estimate, that ends up being about 3 months ahead of when the bids are open. Because we come in, we do our engineer's estimate, we get the allocation, we finalize the contract package, we go and do the advertisement, and then we do a bid opening. So there's that time lag. You'll see why that's important as we go through this. It's also important to understand that we do our best in our engineer's estimate. It's based on the costs and the trends that we're seeing at the time, but there are two main challenges that we face there. One is we cannot predict the future. We guess at the trends. We do apply our engineering judgment to account for what we see, but we just don't have that crystal ball. And then we're not estimating the cost of the project. Now that sounds odd. But what we're trying to do is predict what the contractors are willing to charge to construct a project, because that's what they're bidding. They're looking at some things we don't. They're looking at their capacity. They're looking at the risks that they're willing to take. They're looking at their means and methods. And then lastly, they're looking at their bottom line. It's their profit margin that they're willing to take. If they've got a ton of work, they may throw a very large bid out there because if they don't get it, it's not a big deal. But if they're really hungry for work, if it's the beginning of a season, they may decide, we can skim a little bit of our profit and come in with a lower bid. So with that in mind, here's what I plan to cover for the next few slides. I want to cover the number of bid open against the number of bidders that are bidding on our projects. Then I'll show you kind of how that low bid against the engineer's estimate is impacted by the number of bidders we have. This is going to start the graphical portion of the show, if you will. And then I'll get into the price of materials. So if we go to the next slide. This is a graph showing two trends over the last 12 months or the last year or so. The blue line, which has the big mountain in May, shows the number of projects that we open bids on for the given month. The axis for that is on the left. The orange line is showing the average number of bidders we had during those same months. The axis for that is on the right. So as you can see, and I'm going to use the big spike in May, we saw a significant amount of bids being opened, and there was a dip in the average number of bidders that we saw during May. Then as the number of bids that were out on the street decreased, the number of bidders we had started to increase as well. Some things I'll use this slide to bring to your attention is typically when we get 3 or more bidders, we find the low bid to be right around the engineer's estimate. When we get 5 or more bids, we do tend to see the low bid below the engineer's estimate. Now, that's all, I used words typical and tends because as you'll see on the next graph, there's a little difference that happened in February. But over the last year, we saw a significant amount of projects that opened in May, and also during that time, the number of bidders dropped. But since that time, we've had fewer projects being opened, and the number of bidders has subsequently increased. If you look in January and February, we've gotten more projects opened, but the number of bidders has also remained pretty steady and even increased slightly in February. So from a number of bidders perspective, we are around where we want to be in terms of competition. Let's go to the next slide. This is taking that same number of bidders that we just saw. That was the orange line. Now I've plotted against the right side axis. And also look at how the total of low bids for a month compares to the total of the engineer's estimates for all projects that were open. And it's as a percentage. So if all of the low bids were, say, 10% above the engineer's estimate, then there would be a 10% on that. So negative is good. Positive is the low bid is exceeding our engineer's estimate. Full transparency, though, this method of doing a summarization of the low bids and the engineer's estimate can skew the results. So if you've got a very large project that maybe goes 5% over and several smaller projects ahead below that, as you summarize that, it might skew your total low bids to your engineer's estimate. So we are looking at some other metrics that might provide some better insight. We might start looking at average of low bid. But from the data, you can see that there's still some volatility, and that the correlation between more bidders driving bids down kind of broke a little bit during July through September of last year. And then as I noted, we have a spike in February that we might not have expected with the number of bidders that we're seeing. So because this data, though, for February especially, is only 2 weeks old, February ended a couple weeks back, we haven't had the opportunity to determine what's causing some of this. However, I don't want to come to the commission without a potential answer. So I'm going to try to address that in the next set of slides when I look at material costs. So you can skip the next slide because it's a duplicate of the bidding information. I meant to pull it out before I submitted the slide deck, but I didn't get to it. So here's the 6 material costs that I think I've shown in previous presentations as well. But they do have an influence on bids. And this is information that we collect directly from our project bids. We publish the data quarterly, and since we haven't finished March yet, we only have data through Q4 of 2023. But it kind of presents a nice situation in which we get to guess at to what happened in February. So from the graphs, you can see how the bid prices fluctuate quarter to quarter. And then we can take a guess at those trends. Almost all of them are an increasing trend, with the exception of the Portland cement concrete pavement, which is the lower middle one, and the bar reinforcing steel, which is the lower right. Those are actually in a slightly decreasing trend. Everything else is in an increasing trend. It's also good to understand again that there's that time lag of about 3 months between the time we estimate and the time we open up those bids. 3 months ends up being a quarter. So everything that we estimated using these price points in December, those are now coming in for opening in, say, February. So even though we have the competition that we want, where I'm going with this is, if you look at those materials, if they were to recover, because each of them have a decrease in December, there's this dip in there. If they were to recover back to their previous areas, you'd see a material price increase. So that baseline of what everybody's bidding on has increased. So even though we're seeing more bidders, we might expect to actually see an increase in the bids that are coming in, the bid pricing. So all of that to kind of get back to my original point was, while our engineers and our estimators are doing our best to predict what that cost is going to be, sometimes we're guessing at what that next step is going to look like. And at the end, it's still an estimate based on the information that we've got and the information that's available. And with that, if you go to the next slide, thank you. Happy to have discussions, answer any questions, but appreciate the opportunity.
Jeff, thank you. Let's continue in the format that we have addressed the two earlier topics today. So I want to give an opportunity to guests in the room to come forward. Okay. Okay, thank you, Douglas. Virtual guests?
Not seeing any requests from our virtual attendees.
Great. Staff and commissioner colleagues? Tim Sobelman, you're leaning in, please.
I was giving everyone else an opportunity. I think we've the audience online we wore them out in the last two presentations. I did have a quick question. It's related to delivering in the fourth quarter, and you bring up a really good point about the timing of when the engineer's estimate is done as compared to when the project is advertised. If you could go back to the slide, sorry, Brandy. It's go to Jeff's slide five. Actually, no, go slide 6. Right there. So I'm looking at the project's RTL, they're ready for advertisement. It's showing that you're about 25% by the end of the month, by the end of the quarter, maybe a little bit higher. And so we're looking at delivering a substantial portion of the planned projects in the fourth quarter. And when that happens, the estimate is a little bit earlier than that. We've seen a little bit of a trend in regards to the timing of when those projects are able to be advertised, which then extends the time frame to which the original engineer's estimate was done, and it goes for advertisement. Are you guys doing anything internally to try to adjust for that? Because when you have that many projects being delivered late, to get them out on the street for advertisement, it does take a while, doesn't it? And we'll share our microphone. Just have a conversation.
We can put it between us and lean in. No, appreciate the question, Tim. Fourth quarter deliveries are always, it is something we are trying to, again, get away from. If you look at the graph, or yeah, you look at the chart here, you look at the graph here, we have a lot. Last year, we had over 50% of our deliverables for RTL made in fourth quarter. We're trying to avoid that. To your point, when we deliver those projects, they'll come in for allocation usually in August or October. So you've already got your engineer's estimate at that time a little bit delayed already, built 2 months into it. So that there is one of those reasons why we're trying to get them out of the fourth quarter. That's why we're doing things like trying to allocate projects earlier, get them started earlier, and get them started right so that we can move that out of there. And then to address your question in terms of what that impacts in terms of cost, if we could go to slide, I should have this memorized, 7? Okay, just, oh, yeah, just go down 3 then. That one. So when we deliver in fourth quarter, we're going to allocate in August and October. We should be going to advertisement then within October, November. We're going to start seeing those bid openings January, February. And we do have a spike in February again. But we are seeing, usually we're not getting the decrease in bidders. So we're not impacting the capacity as much. The big spike in May is not always due to that. It's not due to the previous fourth quarters. Those are due to our minor projects. Those are due to our maintenance projects and other projects that get stacked up there. So there is an impact there, but we don't meter the projects out either. We deliver them, we get them on the street as soon as they're available. So all of that to say, even though we're stacking the projects up for delivery in the fourth quarter, we get them out as soon as we can afterwards. And we aren't seeing a large impact in terms of the number of bidders or the capacity of the industry to take those projects on. But what we will see is, and I won't make you go to it, those material graphs, you all saw those had an upward trend. So I would think that as we delay that bid opening from maybe 3 months to 5 or 6 months, we are going to see higher material costs if we're in that environment. Interesting enough is if we were in a different environment like we were several years back and we were seeing decreases in bidding trends, we'd actually be saving more money. But we'd be still exacerbating the fourth quarter. Did that answer?
You actually answered my second question at the end there, so I appreciate that. I do want to thank Caltrans. The project delivery reports contain significant amount of information that helps us provide the oversight, and so it's really helpful for us to get it on a quarterly basis, and it does help us to have conversations with Caltrans directly. So I appreciate that.
You have a question, and it might be silly. Is there some reason why we can't have the engineer's estimate closer to the time that you open the bids, or at least reevaluated closer to the time you open the bids? So you don't have that 3-month gap in there?
So part of that is we put the engineer's estimate together for the RTL package, and
Right.
that's used to get the allocation. And so there's that timing of that process between getting the engineer's estimate and getting the allocation. If we were to go and update that engineer's estimate, and now it's over the allocation, we might have to come in then for a supplemental to the advertiser. Or I think it would get into the process a little bit there. So there's some of those built-in plays. The other thing is after that allocation, then it has to go out and hit the street and go through the ad process. Usually those ads can be anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, which might be another month. So some of that's just the inherent process.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking it wouldn't be every time, but if, let's just say you do the estimate in December and you see in February that there's some change, all of a sudden the prices went up for everything. We see that. Do you not then adjust that estimate? You just let it go?
We then go out based on the allocation.
So one of the limitations in this process is that Caltrans has to have the funding to be able to award the bid. And so when we allocate those dollars, Caltrans then has to go out to bid, take the bids in. That's why sometimes you see that Caltrans will come back and say, bids come in higher than we expected. We need that greater than 120 as part of the process. And so there is that inherent inability to update the bid depending on where they are in the process between allocation and actually awarding the bid itself.
Because I know that's been a question from commissioners, a lot of, how can we keep hearing this is so much higher than the estimate? Why don't they look at it as they go along? So that makes sense.
Commissioner Tiffany?
I think you've already answered the question I was going to ask, which is normally I would think of if bids, going to bid is delayed, I normally would think it's always going to be higher because prices always increase over time. I mean, you mentioned materials, but labor costs, everything, things seldom go down. They go up. And so, and it sounds like to a certain extent, you do see that, particularly with materials, but obviously given that, pushing things to the fourth quarter, obviously then can significantly affect cost and mean that you're going to have higher bids. And so that is a significant, it seems like that would be a significant concern. And the more you can try to address that and shift it earlier in the fiscal year, the lower your bids are going to be.
That's the hope. But again, we don't always control the bidding environment itself. But yes, that's part of the drive. The other part is it's hard on staff when you're stacking
Sure.
everything up in the fourth quarter for them to deliver. And so we have a lot of staff working on the projects. And that, just like any of us, they don't like coming in Monday morning and their stack of papers has
Right.
doubled.
And I was going to also ask, how do you see weather affecting the bids? I mean, we go through a couple of years where there's a lot of weather after a long period of drought. Are you suddenly seeing bids go up potentially because the weather is going to cause more delays, which will create more costs? I'm just curious, do you see that?
Full transparency, I haven't looked at that type of data yet. Anecdotally, I would think that if we've got drier weather, then our construction windows might open up, and so they could get better production rates. And from that, we may see lower costs versus when we're in storms. Then we're seeing more CCOs from storm damage, or we're seeing weather delays and that type of thing, and that will drive not necessarily the bid costs up, but it will drive things like supplementals in construction.
Okay, thank you.
I want to make sure that Past Chair Norton, who's joined us virtually, doesn't have any questions or comments. Past Chair Norton? Oh, okay, thank you. But I do believe we do have others virtually who may now have questions or comments. Can we go ahead and open up the line?
Yes, thank you, Chair Gardino. At this time, we did receive one written comment. It comes from William Walker. He writes, consider thinking about how we develop programs to build the pipeline into this industry so we aren't short our recruitment goals. It could help with the bidding environment irregularities. Thank you. And that concludes all comments received at this time.
Great. And I'd like to thank William Walker for listening in. William is the chair of our Equity Advisory Committee.
If I may, we did receive an additional request. We have a hand raised from one of our virtual attendees.
No, I'm sorry. You had your chance.
Fair enough.
No, please don't go away, virtual attendee.
All right. I'd like to call on Martha Armis Kelly.
Hello, thank you. I really wish, and I hope that when you say that you're going to look back and look at the data, I think that there's a lot of data out there right now that is showing how climate has played a big impact on the costs, the rising costs of labor, materials, even, if we don't have access to those materials. So I'm kind of curious as to, is there a way that we could create like a window or a buffer of cost that would go either way? If we make it under budget, then that's great, but like aim high. And if we are able to stay under budget, then that money would go back into I guess the pot, so that we could have more money for other projects. Because I think that when we're saying this is the cost, and then we find out that it's actually more, it's not allocated, and I think it infringes on the other outcomes for other projects as well.
Thank you for that comment. Maybe we could have an offline conversation, but I think what you're referring to is how projects are actually have certain contingencies built into it to account for increased costs or project changes that occur during construction. And then we utilize multiple change management tools to be able to account for those increases. And yes, we're always hoping that the cost will go down, but unfortunately, that's once the contract is let and it is agreed to for the low bidder in this environment, we're really looking at the cost increases that do occur during projects.
And Jeff, maybe I can ask a follow-up clarifying question to what I understood you to be saying when you said you didn't have the data on some of those cost increases that we're seeing. And so when you talk about environmental cost increases, many of those things are built into your engineer's estimate as that data is coming in. What you're really talking about is some of the new phenomenons that we're seeing as climate change is becoming more severe, and we haven't had data to develop those things. But as that data comes in, you're always reinventing, updating, reassessing those things. And so most of that is built into your engineer's estimate. And where you're seeing that fluctuation is where we're having things like torrential downpours, where we're getting 5 inches of rain, where we've never seen 5 inches of rain in the state of California in a day, right?
Actually, that's a good point, Tanisha. Director Taylor. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know how formal I have to be sometimes. But actually, your point's well taken, because one of the things that we do have with weather impacts as well is it can impact the availability of materials. And so, as you said, it does indirectly get built into that engineer's estimate and the analysis that we do at that point when we look at material costs, even when we look at labor costs and things like that. So even though we don't necessarily break it out as a data point, it is intrinsically there. The other thing I'd like to address with the comment is we don't want to necessarily artificially inflate an estimate and then have forced savings at the end. What we're trying to do is make sure that we can manage the program and maximize the number of projects that can go out. So while we may take still a conservative approach in how we're trying to anticipate the costs, we don't necessarily want to overinflate and then come back in and have a savings, because we may not have a project ready to go at that point.
And to answer your earlier question, Jeff, today is less formal. Tomorrow is black tie optional.
I'll wear my jacket then.
There you go. Good. Okay. Are there any other virtual or in the room questions or comments?
Not seeing any requests from our virtual attendees.
Thank you very much. Jeff, would you like to make any closing comments?
Just thank you again. As Tim said, I've got a temporary assignment, so may not be providing these anymore. Somebody else will. But it's been my pleasure, and I do enjoy being able to share the information with you so you guys can make your decisions that you need to make.
Thank you.
Jeff, thank you again. And Tim, is there anything that you would like to close us with? Director Taylor?
Thank you to all of our presenters and everyone being here today.
Absolutely. Do we have any public comment as the last item on our agenda?
Not seeing anything in the room and not seeing anything online.
Great. Any other closing comments from our colleague commissioners? With that, then,
I just, an important comment came in from Rachel Donovan. She writes, Jeff Wiley rocks. Thank you.
there we go. Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second on that opinion? Second. There we go. We want to thank you all, especially our incredible team, staff team from both agencies for putting together today's project delivery workshop. We are going to stand adjourned with a reminder that there is a reception this evening at 5:30 p.m. Could someone on our team remind us of the location for commissioners, guests, staff that would like to participate in that?
I can do that. So
Okay.
we are at Noit at 399 South First Street in San Jose, California at 5:30. The reception is hosted by VTA as well as WTS San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like is it at the VTA office then? No, it's at, great, 399 South First Street, 5:30 p.m. Thank you all. We stand adjourned.